Hi, welcome back again. I'm Steve Hicks. This is There's Something Happening Here, and this episode is all about the recent political transition in England, where the former queen passed away and now her son is the new king. For this segment, I'm going to call it The King or the Prince, and we're going to talk about our reaction, like the people's reaction to the changing of the guard, so to speak, and where we should put our faith, where we should put our hope, where we should be looking for what's really going on. So let's take a moment to analyze the new king, King Charles. He's been in the public spotlight for a long time. He's been in my consciousness for my whole life. And as I said in the last segment, I don't care about the royal family at all. Like, not even a little bit. And somehow I know a lot about this dude. So let's just kind of review his history and what he is bringing to the throne now that he is the king. You may remember that he was married at one time to Princess Diana. And you may also remember that he was unfaithful to her. And in his defense, she was unfaithful to him as well. That was not a very healthy marriage, apparently. But if you were alive and paying attention in the 1990s, then you remember that his behavior toward Diana and his kind of behavior through that whole thing consistently dragged down the approval rating of the royal family, consistently, all throughout his marriage, and even more so in 97 when Diana died. You may remember the hubbub about how indifferent the royal family appeared to be toward Diana's survivors, and what a mess that was, and the approval rating of the royal family just went into the toilet. He was unfaithful to Diana with a woman named Camilla, who is now his wife. I mean, he at least made an honest woman out of her eventually and married her. But really what that means is that the current sitting Queen of England is the product of infidelity. And you just can't avoid that. That is just how it worked. He's been a divisive figure throughout his life, really. As prince, he had very outspoken political positions on things. He had his own flavor of environmentalism. And I like the environment too. I'm not throwing shade on that set of ideas, but he was very outspoken, and not even just kind of party line outspoken. He was very, very fringe, I think a lot of people would call him, in his ideas. He went on record in you may remember the Black Spider memos, so to speak, the Black Spider memos, in which he went on and on about like alternative medicines. And, there's a lot of fear currently that he's going to drag all of those things into the throne, into the office of being the king. And he's actually called those fears ridiculous. I don't think that was his word, but he says, like, of course I'm not going to behave that way as king. I'm king now. It's all different now. But, we'll see. As I was putting together the research for this segment of this episode, I learned that apparently he also has received some donations from various Arab countries, and the circumstances surrounding those donations were maybe not entirely above board. These questionable donations. And so if that's where we stop, if that's the extent to which our imaginations will go on this issue, then all we're left with is King Charles. And if we really want to push the envelope, it's King Charles and Queen Camilla, right? That's it. We just have to evaluate these people and hope for the best. I hope that he's going to have the right outlook for the throne. I hope he's going to lead England forward in a spirit of unity. I hope. Do you think we can do better than that? Do you think we should be able to do better than that? See, I do think so. I think that our leaders, and not just in England, but in America and all over the world, that our leaders generally fall short of being the kind of inspirational leaders of the past who changed the world for the better and all those things. So I certainly hope that we can look somewhere better than the throne or the presidency or, whatever, right? The leadership of any given country. I hope there's something better available to us. And if you remember our quick Bible study from the previous segment, we saw in Daniel chapter 10 in the Old Testament that when Babylon fell to Medo-Persia, and then prophetically when Medo-Persia was going to fall to Greece, that there was actually a spiritual battle. That angels from God and angels who serve the devil are battling over who's going to get to influence and control these nations as they rise and as they fall. And we saw a heavenly character named Michael show up and conclude a battle that was taking an angel 3 weeks to, he spent 3 weeks fighting it and still wasn't successful. And only Michael could conclude that battle. So who is Michael? Well, if you remember from our previous episode, Michael was one of the generals in that war in heaven. If you want to review that, you can find that in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. So Michael is apparently a really important and powerful character up in the heavenly realm. And if he's also involved in the rise and the fall of nations, it behooves us to know something about him. Well, he is called a prince in chapter 10. He's one of the chief princes. He shows up. He's called the prince again in chapter 12 when Michael, the prince, stands up. But he actually has something in common with King Charles insofar as in the scriptures he is a prince, like Charles used to be a prince, but then over the course of the book of Daniel he seems to elevate to some sort of higher royal statute. So even in chapter 12 he's still called a prince, but he's now like standing with authority and power over the devil in defense of the people of God. So if Charles started out as a prince, elevated to a king, and Michael has a princely title, but a kingly set of responsibilities, and both of these characters are involved in the transfer of political power, then it seems like we should be looking to one or the other or both of these figures as we go through this political transition right now. Who do you think is going to be a better leader? Charles or Michael? The king or the prince? Well, let's find out who Michael is. Grab your Bibles. We're going to do a quick survey of some New Testament texts to really understand who is this character. Join me in the book of Jude, please. Jude is a tiny little itty-bitty book right before the book of Revelation. It is 1 page long and like a little bit. So it's essentially 1 page long, 1 chapter long. And I'm looking in the book of Jude on that first and only chapter in verse 9. There's data in this chapter that is not relevant to our discussion, but it begins by saying, verse 9, yet Michael the archangel, and then it goes on to tell us what he did. But we're using that verse to establish the fact that Michael is the archangel. What that really means is that he's like the chief. He's the principal. You can't have more than one archos. In some contexts, that's even the creator. So he's the leader of the angels, implicitly the creator of the angels. He's above the angelic army. He's in charge of it. Okay, what else does Michael the archangel do? If you flip backwards to the book of 1 Thessalonians, we're going to see something the archangel does. Now here's a little piece of Bible trivia. All of the books of the Bible that start with the letter T are all in the same place, and they're in alphabetical order. So if you find yourself in Timothy, you know that you're more or less in the same place that you're going to find Thessalonians, but you have to go backwards because TH comes before TI. So First Thessalonians is where we're going to be looking in chapter 4. First Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 16 tells us, and this is the context is the return of Jesus Christ, when the future tense, when that will happen. The promise is, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And so at the return of Jesus, when the Lord himself descends from heaven, there is accompanying that action a shout or a voice that comes from Michael the archangel. Even though we don't see the word Michael in that verse, remember there can only be one archos, right? So archangel is a singular position. So Jesus comes back, the voice of the archangel sounds, and in response to that voice, the dead rise from the grave. And now we're going to go to the Gospel of John for our third and final verse in this little study. Gospel of John is the book of John that does not have a number in front of it. So look for that Gospel of John, chapter 5. And in verse 25, Jesus says the following: Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. So when we take these three verses and we compare them against each other, we realize that the voice of the archangel raises the dead from the graves, and Jesus says it is his own voice that raises the dead from the graves. And with that data, we can only draw one of two conclusions. Either there are two distinct characters in heaven with the power to raise the dead, or Michael and Jesus are the same character. You can't draw a third conclusion besides that, right? Based on this data from these verses, those are the only conclusions that we can draw. And I am of the firm belief that Jesus is unique. There is not another Jesus figure up there. Only God can raise the dead. Only the Son of God, that second person of the Trinity, has that power. There's only one creator, and so therefore Michael and Jesus must be the same person. Now that should make sense to us if we take a moment just to think all the way through. Because the name Michael translates to who is like God. And it's a question, really. Who is like God? Oh, it's this guy. Michael is like God, just like Jesus is like God. He's the living image, the living embodiment of God. So Jesus as the person was not born until the New Testament era, so that pre-existent figure before he became a person had to have a different name in the Old Testament. And Michael is the perfect name because there's this figure who is uniquely like God. Of course his name will be the one who is like God. So if we start there, we recognize that Jesus Christ, in his kind of divine eternal form, is the one who actually is in charge of the transition of nations. He's the one who is controlling the army of angels who are doing the fighting with the unholy angels over who's going to be in charge and what it will look like. And as we saw in Daniel 10, every once in a while, the battle is too big for anyone other than Michael to make it happen. So Jesus is very different than Charles. Prince Michael, Jesus Christ, is a very different figure than Prince and now King Charles of England. I think if we're going to make it through this transition in a positive way, regardless of what happens in England, regardless of what happens to the throne, regardless of what happens in Europe more broadly, for good, for bad, for somewhere in the middle, we're going to do much better to look to Prince Michael, Jesus Christ, than we will to look to King Charles. Because Charles is a person. He's going to fail. Even if he does an excellent job, he will have moments of failure like we all do. But who will never fail? Jesus Christ will never fail. He'll never fail. So our last text for this segment, we're going to look back in the book of Daniel, but this time in chapter 2. Okay? Daniel chapter 2. It's a really important chapter we're going to spend some time in, I think, in the next segment. But right now, I just want to look at 2 verses. Daniel, the 2nd chapter. What's going on here is Daniel has just experienced a miracle. God has spoken some information to him supernaturally in a dream. And so he wakes up the following morning. He is realizing the miracle that has taken place. And we're going to read from his prayer that he says to God in response to this. Verses 20 and 21. Daniel answered the God of heaven and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings." And it goes on from there. But we have this idea very plainly stated. It's not Nebuchadnezzar. It's not Persian King Cyrus. It's not Donald Trump. It's not Congress. It's not even the American electorate who go to the polls, okay? None of these things are actually the mechanism in charge of transferring power from one thing to the next. Biblically speaking, it's always God. And if we believe that by faith, then we can still have our political opinions, of course, right? I have my political opinions too. But we have to accept by faith that whatever is transpiring on earth is somehow related to the will of God, because it ultimately comes from the hand of God. Now, that poses everybody a problem, right? Because statistically speaking, here in America, half of us really liked the former president and really don't like the current one. And then the other half of us really did not like the former president and do like the current one. Or maybe not, the polls are pretty low right now. But you see my point? We're kind of divided into half. And half of us like one thing and half of us like another thing. But if God is in control of having brought both of those things into prominence and power, then that means all of our opinions have to take a back seat, a second priority to that. Maybe I don't like the person or the administration in charge right now, but there's a reason why God is allowing it to happen. Or maybe I don't like the person or administration who was in charge a couple years ago, but there was a reason that God had that system in power at that time. So as faithful people, our job is to look underneath, or I guess above, above the person in charge or the system in charge, and recognize it is always Michael the Prince, Jesus Christ, who's really the one in charge. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for tuning in to our second segment here. We're going to take these ideas and really apply them in ways you're probably not expecting in our future segments. So thank you again for tuning in. I pray that you have hit all your subscribe buttons that are necessary, and I will see you in our next episode. God bless you.